ready? I think it's time to start. The sixth panel of this conference, Late Socialism and the Cold War. I'm the chair. My name is Adelina, STEFAN, and I'm a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study, but also I've been affiliated with the Department of History at CU this year. I was a visiting professor. I will now present the first speaker for today. Judas EVERETT from University of Wrocław, who is an MA student and who is going to talk about how the hypernormality of communist systems was punctured. Judas, you have the floor.
Okay, great. Okay, so kind of to echo people's comments about thank you to the organizers. I'm sure there's a lot of kind of bureaucratic and the kind of work that everyone hates to do, so thank you for that. And also thank you to the other speakers for teaching me about things that I was unaware that I didn't know about. So it's been a very interesting experience. Anyway, as you can see from the picture, I'm going to talk about basically the end of communism, and maybe we'll see why the strange name first. So, yeah, a little bit of an outline. What is hypernormalization? And then we can look at some different case studies and how this hypernormalization was punctured and how it led to the end of communism in these specific countries. Okay, so first we're going to watch a film.
The original dream of the Soviet Union had been to create a glorious new world. A world where not only the society, but the people themselves would be transformed. They would become new and better kinds of human beings. But by the 1980s, it was clear that the dream had failed. The Soviet Union became instead a society where no one believed in anything or had any vision of the future.
А если у вас было желание, какое вы смогли бы выразить сейчас?
Чего?
Желание, если у вас есть, например, какое у вас было бы сейчас?
Чего?
Желание, мечта.
Мечта?
Да.
Ну, как вам сказать? Не знаю, да, что вам сказать. Мечта. Раньше, не желая, не гадая, ничего не выйдет все равно.
Нет, ну
Я мечтала и гадала, у меня все наоборот идет. И теперь не верю, и никогда не буду думать и мечтать.
А вы верите?
Кому?
Что?
Кому верить?
Ну, не знаю.
Богу? Никому не верю, ничего не верю. И вам тоже.
Ну, у тебя очень странная прическа. Где тебя так красиво подстригли?
Знакомилась с панками московскими, они подстригли.
А что это за течение панки?
Ну, это люди, которые любят свободу, там терпят насилие.
А ты не свободна, да?
Свободу.
Ну, мне кажется, у тебя что-то случилось.
Да, ничего я чувствую.
Если потом тогда расскажешь.
Those who ran the Soviet Union had believed that they could plan and manage a new kind of socialist society. But they had discovered that it was impossible to control and predict everything, and the plan had run out of control. But rather than reveal this, the technocrats began to pretend that everything was still going according to plan. And what emerged instead was a fake version of the society. The Soviet Union became a society where everyone knew that what their leaders said was not real, because they could see with their own eyes that the economy was falling apart. But everybody had to play along and pretend that it was real, because no one could imagine any alternative. One Soviet writer called it hypernormalization. You were so much a part of the system that it was impossible to see beyond it. The fakeness was hypernormal.
Okay, so maybe you're wondering why I spent some precious moments on this film, because for two reasons. One, I think that it's important that before we look at something from the individual point of view, that you are in that mindset, that you kind of feel what these people were feeling. And the other reason is that this is actually how I stumbled across the idea, so to be intellectually honest, I thought maybe it was best. But anyway, these are some of the quotes, and it came from this guy, Alexei Yurchak, and he basically wrote a book called Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More. And it was about how every part of life in communism was so well rehearsed that there seemed to be no end. It just happened because it happened. And even though you knew what people were saying was not the truth, and you knew that the people in your building knew that it wasn't the truth, and presumably all the people in your country knew it wasn't the truth, it just rolled on and it rolled on. So what really interested me about this is, so why did it end? Anyway, so they called it a break in consciousness. There are several quotes from several important people that basically echo this idea that there was a radical break in consciousness. In Yurchak's book there are things like break in consciousness, stunning shock, and he says that many people remember it vividly. They still remember this break in consciousness today. So why? I mean, some people say it was the economy. For sure the economy wasn't good, as Adam Curtis mentioned. Some people say it's geopolitics, maybe Reagan, Star Wars, competition, I don't know. Some people say defeat in Afghanistan. But for me, I can't understand why, for example, this woman who doesn't believe in God or dreams or a better future, why would she risk everything because of any of these reasons? It doesn't really quite ring true for me. So anyway, case studies. I'm trying to go a little bit quicker to catch up my film time now. So the USSR is probably, it's the core, right? It's the key. So this is where we should start. Really, there are two kind of points about this. One is that, of course, intellectuals had been passing, you know, censored works among themselves for many, many years. Nothing happened. But I think that a big change is the fact that this started to reach normal people. And one of these movements, Memorial, set out to essentially document all the people that had died. They wanted to make some kind of mark for them. They wanted their names to be somewhere, and they wanted people to know that this had happened. And they thought, this quote here, it indicates that maybe they thought that this would make it irreversible. I don't know how true that is, but it is what their aim was. And then David Remnick, who has a great book, because he was a Western journalist in Moscow at the time of the collapse, he has a great book in the style of new journalism. And in this book he basically says that Khrushchev tried it, but it didn't go far enough. But it was different in the 80s when he was there. And I mean, I think it's unfair on the USSR, and particularly on the Russians, that it's kind of remembered that it kind of fell around them. When in actual fact, you know, during the coup you had hundreds of thousands of people on the street. And these people, they were risking everything to protest the end of a system that, while wasn't perfect, you know, they believed in these ideals. That's something that comes up in Yurchak's book. They believe in ideas like community and sharing and communal responsibility. But, you know, they also knew that something had to change. And so how hundreds of thousands of people who may have been through 3 generations of purges and 3 generations of some kind of political suppression decide that they will go to the street, for me, is quite powerful, I think. Okay, so I think the memorial was definitely important, but it's not just them. I don't mean to give this impression. There were many, many groups doing many, many things in this time, and this is just one example. Okay, but about the collapse of the USSR, I think it naturally leads to the Baltics. You can't avoid the Baltics. Basically, they had the best strategy because, well, 1, it worked, and 2, it did what they wanted to do. You could argue that, you know, Gorbachev was successful, but he didn't want to end the USSR, whereas the Baltics did. They wanted independence. So they realized that if they could just get people to acknowledge that the official version of history was not true, that it was a lie, then they would completely delegitimize their being a part of the Soviet Union. So this is what they did. They set out to basically have this very fundamental fact acknowledged. And they succeeded. Actually, Yakovlev, he came out and he said, yeah, no, there was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and yeah, we did that, but it doesn't change that you're part of the USSR. But the moment that he said it, the moment that this Soviet government admitted it, it was over. They were gone. And that isn't to suggest that there wasn't bravery on the ground at all from these countries. For example, in 1991, when troops went into Lithuania, for sure, people behaved in a very brave way, but they had reimagined history and they had reimagined their role. And once they had broken this taboo that nobody talked about, that everybody knew but nobody talked about, then they could do something about it. Okay, Czechoslovakia. So this one is a very, very strange example because essentially what happened was they tried to do a very small change to socialism, and then the Soviet Union came in with a sledgehammer. So the new, very conservative regime in Prague didn't want to rehabilitate the people who had been a part of the Prague Spring. They didn't want to rehabilitate their memories, and they wanted to continue on this path of conservative socialism. But the new leaders in Moscow were, you know, they weren't conservative anymore. They were leaning towards liberal. And as they started to become more liberal, they had more and more disagreements with the government in Prague. So eventually they did rehabilitate, and this was the end. As soon as they started to readdress the memories of the Prague Spring, this was essentially the end of communism in Czechoslovakia. But I did want to mention Charter 77, not because it was particularly important, but because the idea was important, because there was around 350 artists, writers, etc., that signed this thing, which was basically a Bill of Rights. It was a human rights document. It got totally ignored, and they all just got removed from public life. But there was definitely still the desire on the ground, but until this kind of reassessment of history can happen, it wasn't mirrored in anything that was happening at the top. So, yeah, ironically, the battle was actually between Moscow and Prague, but not in the way that you might have presumed, which is quite interesting. Okay, Poland. Poland is a very interesting example, I think, for a couple of reasons. One of them is the two movements. So there were two movements. The bottom one is Solidarity, and it says, we want bread. So, you know, it's a pretty powerful claim. This is another way that many countries broke this hypernormality. When you had miners in the east of the USSR striking and saying, you know, we don't have bread, and then you have people in shipyards in Gdansk striking and saying, we don't have bread, you begin to see that it's not just you that doesn't have bread. Okay, presumably you knew it anyway, but there's something very powerful about people saying it. But then the top one is, this guy on the right is from a band, I forget the name, and this is Jaruzelski, Dead or Alive. And basically, there was a second movement called the Orange Alternative, which was made up of people who were a little bit more maybe academic, a little bit more artistic, and what they did was they just ridiculed the system. For example, when it was the Day of the Militia, they went out and told everybody, today you beat yourselves, yeah? And when it was Christmas, they gave out presents. And when there was a shortage of toilet paper, they toilet papered trees, yeah? Just to subvert this system. How is the most ridiculous method for getting arrested? Yeah? How can we do it? So that was quite interesting, that there was a real movement on the ground, but Jaruzelski was quite reactionary. But in Poland, Polish people are taught that the reason why Jaruzelski didn't want to change anything is because he was scared of intervention from the Soviets, whereas he was actually Gorbachev's favorite leader in Eastern Europe. So it's not exactly true. But I don't think Solidarity really wanted to end communism, because there's a list of some demands that the strike committee made, and some of them, you know, the guarantee for the right to strike, compliance with the Polish constitution, they're pretty basic, but then some of them are pretty communist, I would say. An increase in the pay of each worker by 2,000 zloty a month. Guaranteed automatic increases in pay. Yeah? These don't sound like people who really want to end this system at all. But they did ask for some stuff which they must have known there were going to be consequences for. For example, bringing the country out of crisis by acknowledging and providing information on the reality of the situation. And also enabling all social classes to take part in discussion. These kind of things, they are going to create a problem when people start to acknowledge the real situation. So I think that, in a way, Solidarity didn't mean to end socialism, but once they'd gone this far, it was too late. Also, the government thought that they would increase their legitimacy, like they would win 20% of the seats. Now we are, you know, a modern democratic country. Wonderful. But essentially what happened was everybody just spoilt their ballots so that the communists couldn't win enough. So it was pretty smart, and the idea was that they were going to be a model. In Moscow, the idea was that this Polish model might be a model for the rest of Europe. This kind of semi... 2 minutes, okay. So Hungary, which I will do very quickly. Hungary is not as dramatic as some of the other examples, I don't think. At least that's what the literature said, but I couldn't leave it out because we are in Hungary, so... I think that it's interesting that the mentality was that Hungary was left to fend for itself because the USSR didn't fight to keep certain weapons inside Hungary, for example, and it created the impression that Hungary was on its own. But history and the rehabilitation, the trigger was, I have the guy's name here, Pozsgay. He actually went public before the government was ready and told them that actually we rehabilitate these people. 56, it was a big mistake by the Russians, we don't agree, and this triggered the whole kind of train of events that they couldn't cope with. And then they held the elections on the anniversary, showing how important it was. And then in terms of the conclusion, yeah, I think it's very sad for me that at the end of the Cold War, when it was brought down from the inside by the individual perspective is pretty ignored, and that's a great shame, I think. But also, history played a central role in reimagining this country and what they stood for, and trade unions and popular strikes showed that the situation was the same all around the country, all around the region, and it changed people's minds. And I think combined, and no doubt with a lot of other factors, it really did change something. But I don't think puncturing was enough. There is a whole nother presentation required for how they got rid of these systems. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Judas, for this very interesting presentation. Now we have Tinatin JAPARIDZE from Columbia University. She's an MA student at the Harriman Institute. And she's going to present a paper about Dear Mr. Andropov, American Child Ambassador Writes to the Soviet Communists.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I wanted to thank our hosts, of course, the Corvinus University and the CEU, and my very special thanks to Professor Bekesh, and of course Professor Phillips and the European Institute at Columbia University for bringing us here together with my colleagues. I will be speaking today about a little girl called Samantha Smith, who I came across in a secondhand store in Moscow in the early 2000s when I found a stamp with her face on it and her name written in Cyrillic. That clearly did not sound like a Russian name, and I became very curious. It was one of those projects that I sort of put on the back burner, also considering my young age at the time. I thought, oh, maybe I can research this one day. And I'm certainly indebted to Professor Phillips for encouraging me to keep on persevering with this project that initially was a little bit of a problem in terms of gaining material, but I was able to find quite a bit on this young girl at OSA over the past couple of weeks. So the main thesis that I would like to emphasize in my presentation is that even though perestroika is often attributed to Mikhail Gorbachev, based on some of the material that I was able to uncover, one could argue that, in fact, this was a project that was started by Andropov. And as we know, Andropov was actually a mentor of Mikhail Gorbachev's, and this should come as no surprise as the letter became his successor. There were numerous letters written under sort of Andropov's reign by ordinary Americans that were subsequently published in Pravda, the communist newspaper. As the United States later found out, most of these individuals did not exist. However, there was one little girl who did write to Andropov who actually did exist. And she became a little bit of a soft power weapon. However, the main question is whether she was the American side soft power weapon or perhaps the Soviet side. And this is one of the questions that I will try to answer later in my presentation. It should also be stressed that children were used as Cold War tropes over a long period of time on both Soviet and American sides. This was not the first time, most certainly. And because of our time constraints, I will not go into this in great detail, but most of you are probably familiar with little girl Daisy, Stalin, or Lenin and children, etc. And here we have Samantha and General Secretary Andropov. A quick historical backdrop. This letter is written just around the time of Ronald Reagan coining the USSR the evil empire, which is rather interesting that a little girl from America then decides to write to the sort of the head of this evil empire. The letter on the right-hand side, I was very fortunate to find the original letter, and you might notice some very interesting typos that I decided to keep anyway. But the main question that Samantha Smith asked Andropov was whether or not the Soviet Union was planning to conquer not only her country but the rest of the world, and should she be afraid of a nuclear war, which seems rather interesting coming from the perspective of a 10-year-old girl that she would be asking about a nuclear war, but that's something that we will delve into later. As I mentioned, this was not the only letter written at the time. And also, General Secretary Andropov did not respond immediately, but the letter was published in Pravda. She did follow up rather persistently and asked him if perhaps he could get back to her because she thought the questions were actually rather good. And the response that followed also included an invitation from Andropov to reassure Samantha and her family that the USSR indeed never intended to use the nuclear weapons first against any country, including her native United States. And in order to prove how friendly the Soviets were, she was invited to visit together with her parents to see it firsthand. As I mentioned earlier, I certainly am inclined to view Andropov as the original reformer, also bearing in mind the fact that soft power is not often used as a weapon in literature on the Soviet Union, but rather the United States. If indeed we view this invitation on Andropov's part to invite this young American girl to the Soviet Union as a sort of soft power weapon, then I would argue that this was a way of not only making the United States look good towards the Soviets, but also a way of making the Soviets look as a friendly nation that was in fact eager to get involved not only in a political dialogue but also in a civilian one. When Samantha went to the Soviet Union for 2 weeks with her family, she was invited to meet the first female Russian astronaut, Tereshkova, as well as an all-American lunch, which apparently was burgers and fries and Coca-Cola, with the US ambassador at the time, and most importantly her trip to Artak, where the young pioneers were based. And this, according to Samantha, was the most fascinating experience of her trip. There was no meeting, unfortunately, with Andropov, as allegedly he had a cold. As some of you may know, he had a cold for about a year. As it later turned out, it was a very serious kidney disease, and he died shortly thereafter. Samantha was certainly triumphant abroad, but she also gained quite a bit of fame and press back home in the United States. She was invited to take part as a guest in a TV series on ABC called Lime Street in 1985, and on her way from shooting one of the episodes, her plane, she was traveling together with her father, crashed on the way to Maine, and no black box was discovered on board. There are still various versions as to what happened. There is no tangible proof, but what is significant is that there was certainly a lot more press about Samantha in Soviet newspapers rather than American ones, and Soviet officials, including Mikhail Gorbachev, coined her as a brilliant beam of sunlight and a very important goodwill ambassador who could further help bring the Soviet and American children together as the next generation. There was, interestingly, a Soviet answer to Samantha Smith, a Russian girl called Katya Lichova, who went to the to the United States, excuse me, in 1986 with a peace mission. She met with Ronald Reagan. There wasn't quite as much press on her as there had been on Samantha, but she became quite successful back home in the Soviet Union. She starred in several films. However, she ended up sort of making a little bit of I'd like to say it's very difficult to. Well, basically what ended up happening was the Soviet side asked her to stop participating in press and television shows shortly after her return to the USSR, because apparently it looked like this was done deliberately as an absolute and utter sort of direct response to the American girl's visit to the USSR, and the Soviet side thought that perhaps it would be best to put her on the back burner for the time being. 2 years later, she ended up moving to France, and afterwards she completely disappeared from the limelight to the point where the press has tried to contact her since, but she refuses to this day to give any interviews whatsoever, and a couple of times she was asked about her experience of visiting the United States, and she hinted that it never actually happened, so she doesn't really know what they are talking about, which I found rather interesting considering the amount of press she was getting at the time. We should also briefly touch upon the death of Samantha Smith. The Soviet side claimed that the FBI may have been behind it. Of course, this was not the first time that we had heard a similar story. However, the press at the Soviet, in the Soviet newspapers stressed that this had happened because the FBI accused Samantha of being unreliable and endangering the US national security after she stopped listening to the American side and sort of started siding more with the Soviets. Now, whether or not a 10-year-old girl can really side with either political side is really something else that that I personally find a little bit difficult to believe. However, to this day, there is very, very little available on the aftermath of this tragedy. The only thing that we do know for sure was that the airline settled the case with her mother for $50 million within a few weeks of the tragedy. Now, who was Samantha Smith? This question has been haunting me for the past several months. It is interesting that whether we view her as a Soviet project or an American project, we can interpret her legacy very, very differently. However, what the Washington Times wrote at the time was that exploiting a child to this degree, whether she was a US project or a Soviet one, was absolutely unacceptable, and in fact they compared this to featuring children in porn films, which is very interesting. But this of course does not answer the question as to whose project she was. Before I wrap up, there is more material on Samantha Smith at the Ronald Reagan Library that I'm very interested to see firsthand, hopefully in the coming weeks. But I would invite you to view this Child Ambassador as a project that was also coming to life at the time when the space bridges, the US-Russia television space bridges, were becoming quite a big television hit. And if we view her through this lens, then she was most likely helpful for both sides, and also we can see this as the beginning of citizen diplomacy, something that hopefully we will be able to use in the next few years, as well as I have heard that there are talks about space bridges too. So with everything that is happening that we are seeing in the headlines, it is certainly something that should be welcome, and I very much hope that this is not the very last of citizen diplomacy that we see between the US and now post-Soviet Russia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tinatin. Excellent, very interesting presentation. And the next presenter is Riikkamari MUHONEN, who is a PhD candidate at the Central European University. And she's going to present about the connections of Moscow-based People's Friendship University with the developing world in the 1960s and 1982.
Yes, okay. I would also like to thank the organizers for this possibility to talk about my topic. I'm a first-year PhD candidate, and my project is at a very early stage at this point. So today I'm going to give you a chronological point of view to the topic. How did the Soviet Union develop its contacts with the developing world, and how does the People's Friendship University fit into this framework? So I'm going to start by reading a quote from a magazine called The Soviet Union, and the quote is from 1962, and it's describing the activities of the People's Friendship University. So, the Asian, African and Latin American countries need college-trained personnel to carry through economic and cultural development and to build a new life. With training facilities at home deplorably short so far, knowledge has to be acquired abroad. Young people of Africa, Asia and Latin America who wanted a higher education and could afford it set out for London, Paris, Heidelberg or New York. It took a lot of money. 2 years ago, a new address appeared. Thousands of letters from all parts of the world bore it. Patrice Lumumba Friendship University, Moscow, USSR. This institution is unique among the higher schools of the world. The spirit of internationalism is not something included in the university curriculum, but the students learn it fast. The young people from different countries and of different races are like brothers. Patrice Lumumba Friendship University is a good instrument of mutual understanding between nations of the world, says Tamrat Ndailulu of Ethiopia, a future geologist. So this is where we start from, the early stages of cooperation between the Soviet Union and the developing world. And I think at this point it is important to note that also the Soviet Union itself, we can see it as a multinational empire. So as a starting point, we can also discuss the dealings of the Soviet state with its own minorities and how they were included to the big family of nations of the Soviet Union and how the state cooperated with them. So the goal of the early nationalities policy of the Soviet Union, moving on from the Russian Empire, was to include these different nationalities to the big family of nations. The Soviet state strongly aimed to integrate non-Russian minorities by promoting equal rights in terms of language policy, education, giving these minorities territory and representation in party organs. During the Stalinist era, there was a change in this policy. It turned into promoting the friendship of nations, with the idea of the Russian nation being the first among equals. So there is a massive change in the idea of how the state saw the minorities and how it treated them. So as I already mentioned, I'm arguing that the interest towards nations and the early ideas of anti-imperialism visible in the nationalities policy inside the Soviet Union in the 1920s formed the background of Soviet attitudes towards the developing world, and at the same time promoting the idea of Soviet Union's position as the first among equals within the socialist bloc. But then, if we move on from the internal policies of the Soviet Union to the internationalism, which is a central concept for the Leninist socialism, the background of Soviet internationalism is in the idea that socialist revolution would first spread to the developed capitalist societies of Western Europe and later on the colonial territories. And to support this development, the Communist International, or Comintern, was founded in 1919 to bring together workers' parties from different countries in a worldwide organization, through which the communists would set off rebellions against colonialism. Comintern was one of the first and most important spheres of transnational exchanges in the Soviet framework. According to Lenin, the Russian Revolution had demonstrated that certain stages of socialist development could be very brief. So socialists from the developing world were invited to Moscow to receive ideological education in the immediate aftermath of the October Revolution. And then this policy later evolved into educating foreign communists in institutions such as the Communist University of the Toilers of the East, the International Lenin School, and the Sun Yat-sen University, which was aimed for the Chinese party elites. If we move on from Lenin to Stalin, as I already mentioned, in the field of nationalities policy, it was stated that Russians are the first among equals in the Soviet family of nations. And then also, even though the Stalinist society can be seen as quite a closed society, there were certain individuals and structures that provided cosmopolitanism to Moscow during that period of time. We are talking here about writers and party activists, but in general we can say that the society was quite closed. Also, in the field of development and cooperation, the dissident voices from the developing world were silenced, and Soviet international contacts were largely based on few cosmopolitan intermediaries, as I mentioned. At the same time, the idea that Africa, Asia, and Latin America had no potential to reach socialism in the near future due to the lack of historical conditions for founding of proletarian communist parties was established, so there was a clear change from the Leninist ideas of supporting these countries on their way towards communism. So the Stalinist ideology stresses the special path of Russia, and this model of Russia could not be copied to other countries. So Lenin's faith in the development of these backward countries was replaced with Stalin's idea of skipping stages as a reason for setbacks of communism in the developing world. Also, Moscow's direct involvement in international politics and the developing world declined by the mid-1930s, and Comintern was dissolved in 1943. But the work of Comintern and education in early Soviet universities left a lasting legacy for many leaders of the developing world, such as Ho Chi Minh or Nehru, which again was visible in the internationalism of the Cold War era. Then it can be also mentioned that the Soviet Union supported post-war Eastern European, Iranian and Chinese communists, and then of course Soviet Union also took part in the Korean War. So we can claim that actually Soviet Union again became an active actor in the field of international politics after the war. Then if we move on to Cold War era cooperation, the Soviet Union orientated strongly to international action after Stalin's death by developing contacts, especially outside the socialist world, towards the newly independent developing countries. The Soviet values of internationalism and anti-imperialism were important tools for this cooperation that covered culture, politics, education and trade, and other fields of cooperation, as you can imagine. Khrushchev visited many countries aiming to actively forge ties with them and stated that transitions to socialism could take many forms. Thus, more assistance to workers' parties in the developing world was needed. But on the other hand, the socialist idea of stages of development was still valid, as was the idea of Soviet centrism in the process of promoting global revolution, which caused later on serious contradictions with the Chinese political leadership, and then finally the Sino-Soviet breakup in early 1960s. In the field of education, if we mention a couple of examples, there were research institutes founded in the Soviet Union that were specializing in certain areas of the developing world in order to gain more information about these places to the center. In addition to the state level actions, also connections that did not belong directly to this sphere developed, and I would call these connections transnational, as during the thaw the cultural contacts were created with many foreign countries, and then cultural events such as the World Festival of Youth and Students in Moscow in 1957 gave the Soviet citizens an opportunity to meet foreigners. So we can say that this was an era of revival of internationalism in the Soviet political framework. Also, from outside my topic a little bit, the amount of people with possibilities to travel and profess contacts with people abroad rose steadily. Cultural exchanges were of major interest for the Soviet people. And ideologically an important part of this internationalism was anti-imperialism. And we can see anti-imperialism as an alternative model for modernity and development. And at the same time it was questioning the universality of Western values, so we can claim that what the Soviet Union had to offer for these developing countries was actually an alternative model for modernity, supporting the idea that actually there's a possibility for several modernities in this world, and the Western model might not be the only one. As for example in the case of Central Asia, where the Soviet development was strongly, for example, the city of Tashkent in Uzbekistan was built as a model city to be shown to the delegations and visitors from the developing countries in order to show that this could be your future as well if you cooperate with us. This is the alternative modernity we have to offer. But then, if we move on to my actual topic and the role of education in this cooperation, and especially People's Friendship University, which was founded in 1960. So it was followed by the foundation of the university was a result of a Central Committee secret decree which called for expanded cultural ties to the sub-Saharan Africa. So in February 1961, so a bit after the foundation of the university, Khrushchev stated that his country's intention was to bring thousands of African, Asian and Latin American students to study at the People's Friendship University. So already in the 1950s there had been a relatively small amount of students studying in the USSR from the developing world, but their amount rose steadily throughout the 1960s. And already in 1961 there were 1,667 citizens of the developing world studying in the USSR, and a third of them, around 600 students, were studying at the People's Friendship University. But then we also have to note that the People's Friendship University was not unique in a sense that also other countries, like I have mentioned there, China with the university in Shanghai and India with the university in Delhi, were interested in attracting people from the developing world and providing them with education. As I probably already mentioned, the field of educational cooperation wasn't only receiving students to the Soviet Union, but there were also Soviet experts that were sent abroad. There were Soviet-funded institutions in the developing world, for example in Algeria and Egypt, and in the USSR there were scientific institutes concentrating on the developing world. And also, of course, there were development projects such as dams being built in Afghanistan and Egypt and so on. So it's a very varied sphere. Then if we move on to the attitudes and the everyday life at the university, of course the international students had a major ideological value for the Soviet society, but then again they were also facing racism in the society, which was very contradictory to the official idea of friendship of nations, which was also a big part of the visual propaganda produced by the Soviet state, using these African and other foreign students. So some of the students also, because they got their scholarships through different agents, so some of them were invited to study at the in the USSR through Soviet embassies abroad. Some of them got their scholarships from local communist parties, and some of them were invited by Soviet friendship organizations. So this means, in fact, that several of the students had the possibility to travel both to West and within the Soviet Union more freely than most of the other Soviet citizens. And the goal stated by the university was to develop these students into good friends of Soviet Union, not necessarily into devoted communists, which is also an interesting point of view, because many countries were also quite reluctant to send their students to study there, for example Morocco, because the official view to the university was really quite negative, and it was seen as a very ideological place to study. But in fact, some of the students who graduated from the People's Friendship University had a possibility to continue their studies later on in the West. Many of them were working, having summer jobs in Western and Northern Europe, and only a very small minority later on gave interviews to the Western media about the horrible things they had to experience while staying in the Soviet Union, while for the great majority it was a clear improvement compared to the life they had back in their countries of origin. Also, finally, I want to mention that there was also within the university a lot of, well, in the Soviet context, a lot of freedom of speech for the students, as they had a possibility to organize themselves in different kinds of student organizations. Within these student organizations, there were a lot of different opinions heard. So you would have Pan-Africanism, you would have Maoist students, you would have all kinds of ideologies present, and also, which is also due to the mixed background of the students and how they actually got into Soviet Union, they also had a chance for large and visible demonstrations on the Soviet scale. So, for example, in 1963 they had a small demonstration at the Red Square due to the fact that one of the African students was killed in the outskirts of Moscow after a fight. So they would be quite visible and quite active in ways that were not really possible for average Soviet citizens. So basically what my study aims to do is that it is, well, you can see it from here, it is connected to the overall political atmosphere and changes that occurred in it, and you can see that there's been research available on these topics, but mine is aiming to combine the individual and the institutional levels that is still missing at this point. So thank you.
Thank you, Rosemary. Now our last presenter today is Scott Van Ness from Corvinus University of Budapest, where he's an MA student. And today he's going to talk about 1968, the Warsaw Pact, Operation Danube, and the coalition of five. Do you have your presentation on the memory stick?
No, I don't really. I can do it. I can do it without it. Pictures really don't tell that much. But easy day. So first, thank you for everyone for inviting me in and being part of this group. I'm not really a scholar. I feel like I'm kind of an imposter here. I finished my bachelor's in 2004 and spent the next decade or more floating around the world. So I was kind of as an interloper here trying to study again and then get smart again, and I appreciate being invited in to participate with all these actual scholars. I'll be talking about the Prague Spring and the decision by some of the Soviet or Eastern Bloc countries to intervene with the Soviet Union, and I started thinking about this because I'm very interested in coalitions, having worked in and amongst coalitions for a long time, and it's been a focus of my studies here. And I thought on the Cold War, looking at the Cold War, looking at it from the other side kind of perspective, and so I looked up Warsaw Pact operations, and really the only one that popped up was the invasion of Czechoslovakia. And when I did my research, it turned out after all, it's not really a Warsaw Pact invasion. So we'll go through that, and I'll talk to it. Also, sitting here is an international relations, so there's going to be a little bit of political science in here. I hope you all don't mind. Again, a lot of misconceptions around the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia, known as Operation Danube. One, that it was in fact a Warsaw Pact operation. I'll kind of show you how that's not true. And another idea that the Soviet Union was kind of controlling the Warsaw Pact. It was a transmission belt, just another way of them pushing their influence to the other countries and getting their agenda pushed around. When in fact you'll see that there was actually a lot of variance, a lot of negotiations within this, and that the individual non-Soviet Warsaw Pact members had a lot of latitude to get their own agenda pushed. And then last, that Czechoslovakia was somehow trying to break away from the Warsaw Pact and the Eastern Bloc. This also is not true. They were, in fact, very prominent to try and get the Warsaw Pact to be involved with the problem again, because they realized that there was that the Warsaw Pact organization, institutionalism, offered them some security from the other nations intervening when they went against their agenda. So again, we'll see something. This is more of a coalition of the willing, if you will, against Czechoslovakia and pursuing regime change. So maybe there's a bit of relevance, and that this unified response that you see, it wasn't immediate. It wasn't the delay in intervention from January to August isn't because necessarily that they were giving Czechoslovakia time to fix their own problems. There's part of that, but it was also them getting their coalition together. They had to understand, or they had to all get on the same page, and at first this wasn't the case. And of course, that they have specifically avoided using the Warsaw Pact in order to do this operation. Again, so a little bit of coalition politics. I was trying to look at this as see what does this tell us about maybe coalitions today and how countries in general operate in coalitions. There's a lot of theories and thoughts of this. It basically fall on either side of realism or a pluralistic, liberalistic idea. For the realists, interests, immediate gains, and a common threat are kind of the idea. This is what drives an alliance. I need more power on my side so I can get my agenda pushed and defeat my enemy. Whereas the liberalist, pluralist side says, no, it's more about norms. It's common identity. I believe the same thing as these people believe, so we're going to team up together against the people who believe something else. And then as these coalitions form, they use these interests and these norms to drive their negotiations and become cohesive. Usually people argue one side or the other. What I'll try and show is that it's really a combination of things. It's more complicated than just saying, oh, one side has interests and the other side, they're all just friends and buddy-buddy. It's a lot more complicated than that. And then part of this comes in with the security dilemma, which is usually a realist kind of ideal, based off of kind of a similar system to the arms race. If I have to improve my security so that I can defeat my enemy, but the enemy doesn't realize that I'm just trying to protect myself, and they see that, and they have to then improve their security to compete with my improvement, and so it just ramps up. The idea in the alliance and politics is that I need to make sure that my friend knows that I'm their friend, and so I will say, yeah, I'm your best buddy. The problem this runs into is entrapment. So if they think that I will do anything, like I'm always with them no matter what, they may do something and draw me into that conflict, even though I don't want to. The problem is if I try and put too much space between myself and my ally, they may then abandon me because they don't think I'm a good friend. So as you try and make sure that you have your own independence, you have to balance between being entrapped in what they want to do or abandoned by them when it comes to when you need them. So these are the ideas, the interests, and the norms that are at play here, and it's a somewhat complicated thing. So let me give some background on the Prague Spring, just to frame it for a little bit. So when Alexander Dubček regime came to power in early January, they started. They had seen a problem that many of the countries saw with the economics and they're struggling. And the particulars in Czechoslovakia was in the early 60s they had kind of triumphantly issued a new constitution that said where they have an all people state, and socialism had been complete. Like the project was complete. Hooray! We figured we did it. And by the regime kind of understood that this was just to kind of quiet the opposition. Like, hey, look, everything's good and we're all together. But some of the younger generations thought that, hey, you know, the revolution's over. The proletariat's won, and now we have a little bit of capacity for dissension. We have a little bit of capacity for a little bit of pluralism, at least, because there's no opposition anymore. The victory of the communist revolution, the socialist revolution, means that the opposition is gone. So we should be able to have a little bit more latitude. And they were already frustrated because when communist regime took over initially, a lot of people got promoted really fast as they ousted the old leadership. New guys got pushed up. Well, they were often beyond their own capability. When the new generation was getting educated and trained, they had nowhere to go. So you had a very well-trained and educated young generation of communists, but no real place to put them. And so they got a little restless, and they started coming up with these ideas, and this idea that the mode of production of communism isn't just the worker in the factory, it can also be intellectual. We need technology, and these are important things. And they were trying to drive this in, and they got a lot of support from, eventually from the Dubček regime, and they started pushing this new action program of decentralizing how decisions are made and trying to leverage this new expertise that's out there and say, hey, you know, maybe the Presidium doesn't have the right answer, but this group of smart people, they can help us come up with this answer. And part of that was also a little bit of freedom of the press and kind of just a little bit of liberalization and decentralization. The problem is the Czechoslovakian leaders never understood the threat they were putting themselves into. They never really comprehended it. And even to the last, they were completely taken by surprise when the tanks rolled through. It was like, but I thought, you know, you said we were going to work on this. And they didn't realize that the threat wasn't perceived necessarily just as their agenda. It was their control, which you'll see becomes a key issue here. So now I'm going to... So what happens is these countries, the other countries, start to build a coalition to figure out what they're going to do about Czechoslovakia. And I'll kind of go through their interests and their norms individually. So there's one side, East Germany was a main player with Poland and Bulgaria. Poland and East Germany had some similar views, and Bulgaria kind of was just going along because they're closest ideologically with these. East Germany's real concern was, one, there was the protests and the movements in Czechoslovakia kind of had a spillover effect. So there's reports in Poland where they're chanting and they're echoing the chants of the Czechoslovakian protesters, and they're calling for their own Dubček and this kind of idea. And so almost immediately Gomulka sends him a letter and is like, hey, you know, strong communist regimes help each other out. So, you know, you figure this out, buddy, and you're going to help us. We all got to be together. And he, almost in that first letter, he kind of shows this idea that will be the Brezhnev doctrine later, where, you know, your problem can kind of become our problem. So we need a strong regime. East Germany had the same problem. They also had this, they shared this border with West Germany. They're the only two countries. And they had just had the victory where everyone agreed, like, we're not going to acknowledge West Germany until the West acknowledges East Germany. And that was a big victory for East Germany, and they're like, yes, that was like a year before. And now Czechoslovakia is opening up their border, and there's tourists going across from West Germany. And this is, you know, again, the Berlin crisis, and this idea where all of a sudden all the victories that East Germany thought they had are starting to evaporate. And so really, and again, the Czechoslovakians didn't really get this, is that it was a very existential threat to the East Germans, this liberalization in Czechoslovakia. Hungary, on the other hand, saw this as an opportunity. They had their own kind of economic reforms going on, a little bit of motivation and a little bit of liberalization in their economy, and they saw kind of a couple potentialities here. One is that they have a new ally, a new kind of reformist-minded state in the regime, but they can go then to the Warsaw Pact meetings and rely on somebody to help them be on their side. The Warsaw Pact meetings had been dominated by Poland or Germany being fighting against Romania, and so now that Romania was almost on the outs and really wasn't considered a core member anymore. I'll get into that in a little bit in just a second. Hungary saw this as an opportunity, like, hey, we can take a more leading role. We can have another ally on our side, and this is helpful. And maybe they can normalize this idea of reforms. The threat is, however, if they take these norms too far, the Soviet reaction, which Hungary obviously was all too aware of, could then threaten their own reforms. They didn't want this idea like, okay, Soviet Union being like, you know what, this is too much. Clear all the reforms out. Everybody get back to basics, and we're not tolerating this anymore. So they're trying to balance this. They also couldn't say, they couldn't come out too harshly against the reforms, because reforms can be good. It's just maybe these aren't so great, and so they had to really have a measured response to understand, to keep their own domestic agenda going. The Soviet Union. It's interesting because when you see how much he relied on the Hungarian leader János Kadar, you see he didn't want to get involved in this. He didn't want this to happen. He had 3 of the countries, Bulgaria, Poland, and Germany, are almost immediately calling, hey, we need to do something. And very soon they're starting to articulate, maybe the Warsaw Pact should do something about this. Maybe we should not wait for them to fix their own problem. We should go in there and do something about this. And he keeps turning back to Kadar, who's like, hey, and he keeps saying, like, we need to give him patience. There's no counter-revolution. And you'll see this, they keep arguing, is there a counter-revolution? Is there not counter-revolution? And it's really not, it's all kind of semantics. It's basically, do we have patience or do we not have patience? Because the idea that the communist regime was going to completely lose control and dissolve immediately is a bit hyperbolic, but there was a potential there, and were they losing control? And that's where the actual decision comes in. Again, and so Czechoslovakia, they're also in the same time trying to build their own coalition to stop this from happening, and they reach out to Hungary, who's the natural ally, and I think they have a secret meeting before the end of January. So within a month, Kadar and Dubček have a secret meeting, and even then, Kadar says, like, hey, be careful, don't go on an offended path. That's what he says, and he cautions him. He's like, just be careful, don't lose control, take your time, and understand that the other leaders, it's not just about your domestic situation, the other leaders have opinions about this, and if you involve them, talk to them, they might come along too. You just give them some time. Romania, the other natural ally, because they're dissenters. They were dissenters with the Soviet Union for almost a whole decade, and they were paving their own way within the Warsaw Pact. And this is really, they kind of really broke the mold to give the other countries their maneuverability and their room to dissent against the Soviet Union within the Warsaw Pact. But they had a very different idea about it. Their idea was that it's just about sovereignty, and it has, because their internal, the regime, the reforms that were going on in Czechoslovakia would have been no way tolerable in Romania. They had no intent on liberalizing the media or giving any participation to anybody else. So it wasn't based on some sort of common identity. It was more based like, hey, you're going against the Soviet Union, we're against the Soviet Union, let's work together. And they attempted, but there was really no bond. And then for the coalition coming together, what it ended up being these things, these norms and the self-interest that came together is this fraternal solidarity, and what becomes known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. Is that as long as you're not threatening socialism, you can kind of do what you want. But as soon as you start to play with that a little bit, that's when we're going to intervene. And it takes several conferences for everybody to get onto the same idea. And what really does it is Hungary is always dragging their feet and dragging their feet. And even when in one of the last meetings, Kadar goes with his permission, not permission slip, but his like the guidance that from the Politburo, the Hungarian Politburo, was like this is our position, and their position is still very clearly give Czechoslovakia their time. Counter-revolution doesn't exist, and they should be able to solve their own problems. It's a sovereignty issue, and he that's how he starts the conference, and they talk to him, and he warns that the 56 revolution really gets going when you deploy the troops. That was the problem. We shouldn't do that again. And then Gomulka says, that's a good point, comrade, but maybe I think we do need to take care of this problem. We need to take care of it right now, and maybe the next problem we take care of are the reforms in Hungary. And immediately Kadar gets up and says, "Oh no, I'm with you. I mean, like at the end of the day, we're all on the same side, guys. Let's not get carried away." And this kind of so the idea of the single party rule really carries the way. Like you can't get away from that. And when their own internal reforms and their own interests were threatened, that's when Hungary comes back to the coalition, and then within a few weeks they have the invasion. So again, just to review, the Warsaw Pact, they specifically avoided it. Czechoslovakia wanted to try and get that, and they knew that they would be able to get help from Romania, and no agenda or communique that said, hey, we're going to intervene and Czechoslovakia would be approved in a Warsaw Pact environment. And so that's why these other countries avoided that, and they came together to support this the single party rule and this socialism and this solidarity as you can do what you want almost, but you never threaten socialism, or we're gonna get involved. Thank you.
So we'll take one question at a time. Who would like to start the discussion? Your hands.
Okay. I have a question for Tinatin. So at the beginning of your presentation, you laid out the framework of children being this very innocent kind of symbol of peace and kind of humanity as soft power within the Cold War. So I was wondering what you think about the kind of the backlash that Samantha and Katya faced, respectively, with the FBI and the Soviets, in the fact, in the measure where both were kind of posing a threat to both institutions when they weren't fully following the mold set out for them. I don't know, I just think it's kind of interesting that, these Cold War major institutions were so afraid of these small children that they're trying to weaponize in the world stage.
Thank you. Well, I think what's interesting is that children were seen as potentially effective, sort of innocent but effective weapons during the Cold War because of their use. Bearing in mind their age, thinking, oh, they're naive, we can manipulate them, we can mold them into whatever our policy is this week or this year. In both of these cases, especially in Samantha's case, we saw that this was not necessarily true. Whether we attribute this to her or to her parents, at some point it is visible through the archival material that she and or her parents stopped following the script that was handed to her on her way to the Soviet Union from the US. So I think, yes, it's really interesting, although it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, they're young and perhaps we can manipulate them. On the other hand, they're not so easy to manipulate because they are so young. So there's two sides to this coin.
This is also for Tinatin. I was wondering, I guess you allude to it a bit at the beginning about Andropov and sort of how he was sort of maybe the original glasnost or perestroika. And I was also wondering if you were going to refer to sort of a lot of nuclear scares that were going on at the time, I know that in November of '83 there was like a NATO nuclear exercise that the Soviets then picked up on and thought was like an actual nuclear attack. And so like you can see clearly this time is like sort of a lot of maybe mixed signals, people like picking up on sort of war games that weren't necessarily actual nuclear attacks, but like might have been nuclear attacks and nobody was really sure. So I was wondering if you saw maybe a connection between the Samantha Smith narrative and like just hearing that and then knowing that about maybe Andropov's fear of NATO and of the United States. To me, like if I were just encountering it, I would think that like she would have been such a key asset for the Soviets and probably like I think would have been more likely a Soviet plant than like an American one, but that's just what I would think, just from what I assume.
Absolutely, and what's very interesting is that both Samantha and her parents as well claimed that the letter was written in 1982, but it was only published in sort of March, I believe, of '83. Yes, it was March of '83, and in March of 1983, on March 8th, is when Ronald Reagan coined the Soviet Union, the evil empire. So it's rather interesting. Yes, on the one hand, they claimed that the letter was written prior to that, so they had no idea about any of this. But on the other hand, why was this letter published and it became public knowledge only in the aftermath of these very interesting events? So I am also inclined, based on what I have seen so far, that this was a Soviet project rather than an American project. On the other hand, it was probably good for both sides up to a certain point. And what I'm very much looking forward to seeing in the Reagan archives is whether or not it is visible and tangible that at some point this stopped being an American project. Perhaps it was a mutual one to begin with.
Sorry, remind me when Samantha went to the Soviet
She went in the summer of '83 during her school vacation.
I have a question for Judas. So congratulations to everybody. And I guess this question could maybe be applied to all of you because in some way I think all of you deal with, to use Tinatin's term, maybe citizen diplomacy or people moving around, even Scott, you know, people moving down into Czechoslovakia from West Germany, I thought was really Judas, I guess I was struck by your assertion about, you know, people in Poland and people in the Soviet Union both making similar kind of rhetorical statements about bread, right? With, like, you see the other guy saying, we need bread, you know, or we want bread, then you realize that you're not alone. That kind of led me down kind of like a Benedict Anderson place of like an imagined community, but I didn't go that far, you know, I came back. But I was wondering, in trying to connect that sense of imagination to the kind of disillusionment that you kind of documented in the Eastern Bloc, I was wondering how you respond to kind of also like a simultaneous sense of Europe that's really developing within the within Eastern Europe towards Western Europe, and even, you know, I know it's not necessarily your purview, but even, you know, Gorbachev as kind of the European statesman, right? You know, so I'm wondering if how we can rectify or how we can reconcile rampant disillusionment with a belief in Europe or a belief in something that can be done.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I think Gorbachev was a self-asserted leader of Europe. He wanted this new Europe that was somewhere in the middle, and he thought that he had the diplomatic skill to create that, which is ironic given the fact that now Putin and modern Russia pretty much defines itself by being everything that Europe isn't. So it's a very interesting point, but I mean, I don't want to stress too much that the same things were happening. You know, individuals are individuals, and I don't know exactly why each person went out onto the street. But for example, in Poland, they are, well, they still are, but they were motivated by a deep dislike of Russians. And I mean, the fact that they were out on the street is because they thought this system was put in place by people that they didn't like, their historical military enemy. But people who were being vilified in Russia were out on the street protesting against the same system in Moscow. So, you know, I'm careful to, you know, not connect dots that aren't there, but at the same time to say, for sure, the same problems are motivating people in similar ways. So what makes it so interesting is, yeah, so many similarities, but so many differences as well. And that individual layer really, for me, is just so fascinating.
Yeah, I have a question for the presenter on universities. I'm sorry, I missed your name. I'm sorry. I wanted to say that there's a professor at Boston College or Boston University, one of the two, called Margaret Litvin, and she's a comparative literature scholar, and she researches fiction written by, I believe, Arab students who came to Moscow. And I wanted to sort of going off of that, I was wondering, because you emphasized that you were interested in the institutional aspects, but I was wondering whether you might try to look into the sort of daily lives or interactions of the students amongst each other, which I think would be fascinating. And I wanted to ask Judas, what the particular Soviet element is in the hypernormalization that you see, because I think if you talk about, you know, being stuck in a system and not being able to see beyond it, I think, you know, the capitalist system we seem to be stuck in, we're also not really thinking beyond it, right? Or if we look at, you know, National Socialism and the idea of self-destruction until the very end, I don't see what is very distinct to what you were talking about.
Do you want to?
Yeah, I can start. First of all, thank you for
Yeah.
for the idea, because I'm still building my
Yeah.
framework, so all these ideas on what to look for are really useful. And I ran out of time a little bit, but basically my goal, because the institutional level is really missing when you are reading the literature, like all of the people are asking like, oh, there should be research on these friendship societies, and there should be research on all these different actors. So I see the university as an institution, and as an institution it's a valuable part of this field, which is building up quite quickly at this point. To fill up the institutional level. But then again, I also have a strong interest in the microhistories and the interactions and everything taking place within that framework. So that's definitely my goal. And if I can shortly mention about my methods, so alongside the archival things I'm hoping to work on, I'm also planning to do interviews and oral history. So that's definitely gonna be a big part I'm going to be working on. So.
Yeah, if you watch the full documentary, which I definitely recommend to everyone who hasn't seen it, it's fantastic, and he's a great filmmaker and really, you know, very interesting throughout. He pretty much says what you just said, like the fact that people in the present system feel a similar way, okay, it's highlighted in many kind of ways, but I do think there is something a little bit unique about the communist system. I mean, maybe it's difficult to put your finger on it exactly, but in the capitalist system, a lot of people support it because they think that they're going to be the next big it, you know? They think, well, if this famous person has no talent and I have no talent, why am I not the next famous person? So, I mean, and also what we were talking about earlier with this, you know, constant stream of information that you just can't escape. Like, yeah, I think there are some differences, but are they that big? Maybe not, you know. Could you take another couple of minute clip from this film and go to give a talk about hypernormality in communism, in capitalism, sorry, of course. Could you take something else and talk about, you know, these moves to the right in Europe? Yeah, of course. And I think that that's a really interesting thing. People can be controlled and they can be tricked and they can be done in different ways, but at the basis you are still being controlled and you are still being tricked, right? So yeah, I think it's a good point, and one with a little more time I think I would have said.
In the back, sorry.
First of all, thank you all for shifting the focus from high politics to ordinary people, and actually for merging the classical international relations with social and cultural aspects of the Cold War. I have a question for Riikkamari. First of all, I'm really looking forward to reading your thesis. Don't feel pressured to finish it as soon as possible. I think you're dealing with a very interesting social phenomenon which would not have been so massive had it not been for the Cold War. And it, of course, it did not affect only Moscow. It was a part of, like, the same thing, only in smaller amounts happening in all socialist capitals and countries and societies. What I'm interested in is, since it was a part of cultural diplomacy of the Soviet Union and socialist world, and kind of what Tinatin has said, soft power of Moscow, and one of their weapons in this international global competition. I'm interested in what impact it had on, since if the aim was to educate the elites and to form the elites of these newly independent countries, what impact did it have? And since you're at the beginning of the research, I believe it is one of the questions you're asking yourself about. What I'm interested in is how, what methodology are you intending to use in order to answer this question? If it is, was it the other way? Did it have the other way around as well? Like, did it influence the Soviet society and societies of socialist countries as well? So can we talk about a real cultural transfer when talking about this topic, this phenomenon?
Yeah, first of all, that's a very good point, that at least in East Germany and Poland, Hungary, Romania, a lot of socialist countries had students coming from the developing world, and that was a major part of cultural diplomacy, as you mentioned. About the impact of the university, well, the case of People's Friendship University is fairly unique in a sense that I didn't have time to mention, but mainly the students come from the developing world, and only a very tiny minority are Soviet citizens. So it is kind of like a bubble within the Moscow urban landscape, and also kind of like an elite institution in a sense that the people are not necessarily in that much contact. But then again, we have research on these racist attacks. We have research on, well, if we come to the real grassroots level, like if you would go to a disco and you're a black guy and you are interested in the Soviet girls, there might be some conflicts raising among the Soviet guys. So you have all these like little encounters, how would I say, little pieces of information, but there is really not that much larger scale research on how did it really affect the, let's say, Moscow as an urban landscape. So yeah, that's definitely one of my interests. The problem with these kinds of questions is always how do you start the research and where do you find the information. So at this point I'm quite dependent on the archival sources, on newspapers, and then oral history is always a big question mark because I haven't started my interviews yet, so I don't know whether the people will be willing to talk about these kinds of possibly negative aspects of their stay in Moscow. So the future, the next couple of years will show. I'm also looking forward to see how this research turns out to be in the end.
Like the other direction of this policy is the impact or the level of success of this policy in the third world countries. Are you also intending to try to measure or to see whether this policy was successful? Or was it a waste of time and money? Did it contribute to foreign political aims of the Soviet Union?
I'm not planning to go to follow the students on their way home to their countries of origin, so to say. So I'm going to concentrate on the interactions that took place in Moscow. So, of course, if it comes up, then I might kind of like briefly discuss that one as well, but that's definitely not the core of my research on how successful it was and what happened to these people once they left Moscow, but I'm definitely gonna concentrate on the institution and the framework in Moscow.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. I have a question for Tinatin and a question for Judas. I was wondering about what the Reagan administration's official response was to the death of Samantha Smith, and I also wondered what kind of work. I noticed that in your footnotes you had the Samantha Smith Foundation, and I wondered about what kind of organization that was and what kind of work they did or what they do now. And then for Judas, I was wondering, because you started by talking about the USSR and then you moved on to talk about Eastern Europe, and I wondered if perhaps, if you did it the other way around, you could use the fact of 1989 in Eastern Europe as a contributory factor to this puncture happening in the USSR.
Sure.
Yeah.
Your question about the foundation, it's actually, it's very interesting because there's very little available on the foundation other than the fact that her mother ran it, and their goal, according to what their website says, was to foster future goodwill ambassadors, children like Samantha, except all that I was able to find on the website are pictures of Samantha, the letter, and also the press cuts from the period. Interestingly, other than a few articles that are specifically about her death and the aftermath of what happened with the foundation, etc., everything else is Soviet. All of the press cuts that were used on the website. Aside from the fact that Ronald Reagan sent his condolences to the family, there are no public either quotes or anything really attributable to him. So that is one of the reasons why I'm very eager to see what is available in his archives, is because there might be something that might help me figure out whether this really was a joint project to begin with, or if it became a joint project after Samantha accepted the invitation to go to the Soviet Union.
Yeah, that's a good question. But I don't want to say that the events of 1989 weren't important or to imply that in any way. But I think that basically Perestroika came first and Glasnost came first. And in some of these cases, like in Hungary and like in Czechoslovakia, the people that were actually in power in the mid-80s are really not too keen on that at all. And actually it's happening around them and they are reacting to the changes which are mostly coming from Moscow. But the other reason why I decided to start in the USSR is because I think that the changes that were happening on an individual level are not explained by the collapse in Poland, for example. Whether or not, if you live in Moscow or Leningrad or somewhere in the east, and you see that something happens in Poland, do you know? Probably. Do you care? Maybe. And I think that, as modern Russia has shown, they are very, very happy to define themselves as an other. And in fact, it's a big part of, like British identity, Britain is on the edge of the continent, Russia is on the edge of the continent, and it's a big part of defining these identities, this otherness. And I think that, there's a real chance that they could have carried on like that. And the coup shows it. If there was a very different reaction to the coup, or maybe not even a very different reaction, if 10,000 people came out instead of 100,000, I'm not sure that they wouldn't be communist now. I wouldn't be very confident in saying it. So I absolutely wanted to say that this is about the individual and what motivated these people without hopes or dreams to get off their sofa and go outside and risk their lives. And more than their lives, their livelihoods and the prosperity of their family and real everyday concerns. As Solidarity showed, their concerns were mostly about how they're going to feed their family, how can they work, how can they strike. And actually a lot of these guys did badly in the 90s. Most of the guys from Solidarity have not had a fun time. Yeah, like the unemployment, who do you think this was affecting? It was the very guys that were out ending this system. So for me, it's an incredible thing that you can look beyond your own self-interest and go out and really change something. But I had to start in the USSR because I really feel like, you know, without these things happening there, it wouldn't have been possible. So.
Okay, I have two more people on my list. So first.
Thank you. Thank you all for wonderful papers. I really enjoyed them. A couple of questions. First, for Riikkamari, there's a wonderful body of literature on American universities and the university system writ large as a Cold War agent in the United States. So I can give you some of those books. I think particularly if you look at some of the American universities in some of those countries where you're seeing these friendship universities, there may be a Cold War tit for tat that's going on. Even if you just put that timeline together, it might be interesting to see who got there first and whether there was that kind of interaction. And also, I would urge you to look at curriculum. In other words, not just that they were there, but what were they studying, what were they learning, how were they allowed to choose, and I think that would get you into more of the microhistory, but also, and who was designing the curriculum, how was it being designed. And then I wanted to press you on one point, which is what led me to think about the American side, was your talk about modernization, and this very key point of who was going to do the best job of modernizing the other, the Soviet system or the U.S. system. And this is, so key. I've been wrestling with this for 12 years, but this is so key in terms of figuring out economic projects, who's got the better tractor, to who's going to build the better mind, the freer mind, the stronger mind. I think with this kind of unpacking of this, you can really get to some of the guts of this question of the modernizing political system in the process of exchange. So thank you. For Judas, what I was struck by was the secondhand time and these oral histories and what you seem to be getting to when you analyze the points that people were asking for, that these weren't really capitalist points in a lot of ways, and is that where some of this nostalgia comes from? So, in your model, how do you account for nostalgia, for a past, if everyone was just trapped in that past and now it's over and now it's, and so I think that might help you desimplify this hyper-normativity construction that Lato was disturbed by. This idea of the oral histories, but also nostalgia for a past that somehow seems inconceivable, I think might be important. And then Tinatin, after all this time, I was sitting there saying, you have to order her FBI file. She's dead. You just take her obituary. It may take 10 years, but I would order her FBI file. You'll have to order under as many names as possible. I would also order her parents' FBI files. I think there might be some really interesting information hidden in those archives, although it might take time, and the last name Smith is of course impossible, so you'd have to be very specific about them. But the fact that there's a foundation means that there's got to be something somewhere. So I would certainly look there. So that was just a thought, and I look forward to the Reagan. And Scott, thank you for your talk. I think this unpacking of the Warsaw Pact is fabulous. I mean, I really have never understood it. Maybe there's a reason. Piecing it apart like this and making it specific, and pulling it apart is a great service. Sorry.
Okay, I think we have time for one more quick question, and then we have to wrap it up.
Absolutely. So if I can make my regular couple of comments. Actually, we have a little bit more time because then we will, as you know, we will have to move after the short break into another room back to 101. So we have a little more time. So
but most of my comments are really comments and don't need an answer. To Judas, you mentioned in Czechoslovakia, case of Czechoslovakia, there was a kind of small reform. You characterize it as a kind of like modest reform to reform the socialist system, whatever. But this is a very traditional interpretation of the Prague Spring and the whole process, which is by today it's quite outdated. That was what the Czechoslovak reformers and most of Czechoslovak society wanted to believe throughout the decades after 1968, and even in the 1990s. That was the mainstream idea by the historians, even in the Czech Republic and in Slovakia as well. By today, it's gone. But I was already for a very different interpretation that the Soviets were right to suppress the Prague Spring. It may sound very bad here, but actually from their own perspective, from their own imperial perspective, we have to understand that they had no other chance. They had no other chance. Why? Because what was going on in Czechoslovakia, it was really a counter-revolution. They still had power, Dubček and the leadership had still full power, but the tendency of the events, the whole process was leading to a total loss of power by the Communist Party. So without Soviet intervention, just Czech communist system would have collapsed in a couple of months. It's absolutely sure. So in that sense, and it's for scholars, but you didn't emphasize this enough in your presentation, but you talked about the alliance with the Warsaw Pact, that they didn't want to harm that. Well, not yet at that time, because they were clever enough not to talk about something which they knew would trigger a Soviet intervention, right? So that's another issue. So that's something which must be understood. And now most Czech and Slovak serious scholars already also accept this conception by today.
I misspoke, I think. I meant to say that it wasn't as serious as the reforms that Gorbachev did in the 80s. So maybe that would have been more acceptable, which is what I meant to say.
Oh, okay,
so,
fine, just to make it clear. And for Tinatin, it's an extremely interesting project. So I joined Vicky with suggesting that you go further. And just one addition here, which or an idea which could be useful for you. I had researched some documents in the National Security Archive in Washington, D.C., which is a copy archive, but they have a lot of documents from the State Department files. And from 81, 82, 83, I had seen like several documents, which actually prompt that there was a kind of rapprochement in the making on the side of the American government. That is exactly the same time when there is the Evil Empire speech, and then Reagan and Schultz and the others are actually working on a rapprochement. So the Evil Empire speech as well, which was actually an accident. It was only said once, and it was made a big issue by the media. You shouldn't forget it. It was not Reagan's intention. And then it meant that actually what my perception about the whole issue is that what Reagan wanted to achieve, it was not escalate the situation, not try to like be aggressive vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, but actually on the contrary, he wanted to push the Soviet Union to cooperation, to negotiation. And also SDI, the initiation of SDI, exactly at the same time, was basically aimed at achieving the same goal. But that's more or less a kind of new idea. So that's must be understood. But in this context, of course, this whole episode, which looks like a very nice and kind of fairy tale story, in a certain sense, could be framed in this bigger picture. So maybe not, but it's very, very possible, very possible. So you just go, if you go to the Reagan archive, definitely, that will be very important to try to find some evidence for that. Maybe you don't find anything, but maybe you do.
Can I just add one thing?
Yeah.
She will. Because I was just there, and it's absolutely in the archives that he was very interested in this rapprochement as he was making these big statements. So you'll find it.
Go ahead, and tell me the result. Okay? And then to Scott, again, the whole conception and the interpretation was very good, and also very enlightening, and then the whole coalition building, I think it was a very good framework. for your presentation. And there was only one small mistake when you mentioned Ulbricht. I mean, you mentioned Gomulka said about Kadar that you will be next.
Yeah.
That was Ulbricht. That was Ulbricht. Actually, Gomulka maybe had the same in mind, but he didn't say this. But it also shows Kadar's position, peculiar position. You know, it was not just a kind of a guy who was reluctant, you know, as a reluctant ally. He was really a kind of a real ally of Dubček and the Czechoslovak leadership until the last moment in mid-July. And even later, actually. So his position was really something like very special because not because he wanted to save Dubček, but because actually he wanted to have something which could promote not only Hungary but the whole Soviet bloc in a certain sense to a certain direction, the kind of direction of reform, what Hungary was doing at the time. And then he was very serious about that, you know, until he could believe that this could be kept on this track, you know, without the actual danger of losing power. Then we should push for that, you know, to support it. And actually, he took a lot of risks, you know, as you mentioned. I mean, nobody was threatening anybody during the whole period. This was the first time at any of the Warsaw Pact multilateral meetings that one member was threatening another member. It's such a very obvious, explicit threat. It was unheard of. It was absolutely without any precedent, you know. Even the Russians, the Soviets never threatened anybody openly at that session, you know. And then Ulbricht comes up with that. So that was unbelievable. Yes, and to Riikkamari, again, the project is very interesting. So that's something which I'm sure you can and should continue with very much. You just also mentioned one thing which should be clarified. You mentioned that the Soviet Union participated in the Korean War. Which of course was not true. I mean, technically, physically, militarily, the Soviet Union did not participate in the Korean War. It was the Chinese, the so-called Chinese volunteers. Even in the case of China, they were called volunteers. Well, they were 1 million. And they were in nice uniform, but actually, well, that's just a coincidence. But the Soviet Union itself did not. You know. So they were actually trying to keep out of that country, but they were supporting, of course, you know, North Korea.
Yeah, I think that's what I meant.
Yeah, definitely.
Not
yeah, but of course, wholeheartedly. I mean, technically, military in every sense, but not sending troops. Not sending troops. So why the U.S. did, and many other Western nations did the same thing. Okay, so thank you.
Okay, thank you all for participating. And Professor Bekes told me that you will be moving to the room 101, the one where you had the sessions yesterday. Thank you all.
10 minutes.